Good afternoon. My interlocutor today is Andrew Clapham, Professor of International Law at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Professor Clapham teaches international human rights law, the laws of war and public international law at the Graduate Institute and at the Geneva Academy. He was the first director of our Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights from 2006 to 2014. In 2013, I would also like to highlight that he was elected as a commissioner of the International Commission of Jurists and is currently serving as a member of the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. Most recently, he was invited to support an international legal task force on accountability for international crimes committed in Ukraine, which was convened by the Ukrainian prosecutor. In today's interview, we would focus on his excellent recent book, War, published by Oxford University Press, and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Professor Clapham, thank you very much for joining us today at the Academy. In your book, War, which I just mentioned, you draw attention to the legal notion of war. I think this is perceived by many contemporary lawyers as somewhat archaic. We speak mainly today of armed conflicts, also here at the Academy, rather than using the term war. But you insist that war, including the word war with a capital W, still has important legal implications beyond the notion of an armed conflict. Could you please reflect on this a little bit?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me. If one goes back in history, the idea was that during a state of war or a time of war or a declared war, certain rules would automatically no longer apply and other rules would automatically come into effect. And everybody knew more or less where they were because there would be a declared war and one knew when it started and when it finished. Now, as you rightly say, these days one talks about armed conflict and one doesn't expect to have a declared war. But some of those old rules are very much tied to the idea of a declared war. And in my view, and I don't think it's particularly controversial, wouldn't apply just for any old armed conflict. And so you would need a declared war to trigger those rules. And that's the kind of war that I have described as war with a capital W, where we are in that zone. Now, to give a few examples, many of them occur in different national legal orders. And the obvious one, which many viewers will be familiar with, is the crime of treason. So in the United Kingdom and in the US, certain elements of the crime of treason need a declared war, so that your assistance in time of war to the enemy means that we all know what we're talking about. It's a declared war. Another area, which is more complex, is the law of neutrality, where traditionally there would be declarations of war and declarations of neutrality, and everybody knew where they stood. These days, where an armed conflict breaks out, it's not clear that states feel that they have an obligation to be neutral, and that obviously in the Ukraine context now is in a state of flux. I haven't heard, apart from Switzerland, many states proclaiming that they're bound by the law of neutrality. And the last area, and I won't attempt to summarize this, is in naval warfare, where for some states a blockade needs a formal war. The idea of prize courts can only be triggered where you have a formal declaration of war and so on. But that's quite a specialized area. But for some countries you would need a formal war.
Thank you. You mentioned actually Russia-Ukraine, which brings me to my next question, because since your book came out, Russia invaded Ukraine. So would you say that in Ukraine we have a war with a capital W, or is it just an armed conflict?
I would say it's an armed conflict, definitely. I would also say it's a war with a small w, in that it has the sort of enormity of what we understand by war. And I think it's important to reflect that and not pretend that it is some sort of limited use of force, because the devastation is huge. I'm obviously a little partial on this. I'm not pretending to sort of hold a completely independent line. But I think it makes absolute sense to call that a war. Is it a war with a capital W? I think, strictly speaking, in legal terms, Russia has not declared war on Ukraine. Obviously, by declaring it a special military operation, that means they don't consider it a war. In fact, one can be punished in Russia for referring to it as a war. And Ukraine, as far as I know, has not declared war on Russia. So there isn't a declared war with a capital W. And so some of the rules that I was referring to before may or may not apply depending on which box we're in. But maybe I'll just say a little more about this. I feel quite strongly that one shouldn't sanitize the violence by referring to it as an operation or an armed conflict, or worse still, an IAC or a NIAC. Let's call it a war so that we're quite clear that civilians are dying, people are being sexually abused. Not that that should necessarily follow from the fact of war, but to evoke the horror of war and the importance of stopping the war, I think it's important to refer to the situation as a war. My technical point about whether it's war with a capital W is really a bit of a niche interest for specialists. It could become very important. Russia has already seized some merchant shipping in the Black Sea belonging to Ukraine. If it were to seize German shipping transporting arms, say, and declared that they were entitled to do this under the laws of naval warfare, we would be entering into a slightly different space. And how states reacted to that might tip it into war with a capital W.
Well, regardless of whether it is a war with a capital or a small w, we've received, I think, quite a few credible allegations of war crimes committed primarily by the Russian side. And the OSCE's Moscow mechanism recently released a partial report covering the first phase of the recent upsurge in hostilities and detailing a number of war crimes. So, in the face of such a conflict, particularly one involving a great power such as Russia, what is there to be done to ensure accountability for war crimes?
I think there is an assumption that Russia, being a great power, as you put it, and a large military force, that it will be impossible to ensure accountability for war crimes. But this is not so. And if you think about what's happening in Ukraine, I think Professor Sassoli, who was one of the authors of this report from the OSCE yesterday, referred or the day before in a conference I was doing, to at least 700 prisoners of war held by Ukraine. Of those 700, I'm imagining that many of those will be accused of war crimes. So those are people already in the hands of the prosecuting power, which is quite unusual for war crimes prosecutions. And so I think there will be some accountability. I think trials are even already starting now. Now, people will then tell me, oh, but it's not going to be the big fish and so on. But I think one should start where we are, and Tadic was a small fish, as you know, and eventually that led to the prosecution of the higher up. So there will be prosecutions, even against soldiers from a large power. There could also be soldiers on the Ukrainian side who are prosecuted for war crimes by the Ukrainians. So that is going to be possible. And then, of course, there's the possibility that other states could prosecute these crimes. Now, because this is an international armed conflict, as you've mentioned, the war crimes that we're talking about are nearly always going to be grave breaches of the Geneva Convention or of Additional Protocol 1. And that means that those people accused of those war crimes can be detained and prosecuted in any of the states parties to those treaties, which is over 100 states. And that would mean, for example, a Russian general or soldier travelling to London could be prosecuted under the Geneva Conventions Act for war crimes. So for this particular conflict, I would say the net is much wider in terms of the number of states that can prosecute. And it's also much more practical in that Ukraine has already a pool of people which Ukraine can prosecute. So we now have the possibility of prosecutions in Ukraine, prosecutions around the world in third states, and the third possibility, the third leg of the stool, as some people have referred to it, would be prosecution at the ICC. So the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the crimes committed in Ukraine because of the Ukrainian declaration. And the prosecutor is already investigating this. Of course, the $64,000 question is, can the prosecutor physically get hold of someone? But I think that the symbolism of the idea that the International Criminal Court is prosecuting this is as important as any eventual prosecutions. And if somebody were to be arrested, it may not even have to go to the ICC. It could be prosecuted in Ukraine, it could be prosecuted in any one of the 100 states.
Very well. Well, focusing on the national prosecution of, let's say, Russian troops for war crimes in Ukraine. So I mentioned earlier that you were invited to support the task force established by the Ukrainian prosecutor, and according to recent news releases, I think that just today a Russian soldier pleaded guilty to war crimes in a Ukrainian domestic trial. So could you perhaps briefly comment on that?
Well, I can't comment on that particular case because
you're involved,
clearly ahead of the news on me, and I wouldn't like to suggest that I was involved at all. But I think that the idea of this task force is to be able to advise the prosecutor on all the possibilities for accountability. So that might involve prosecution in the International Criminal Court, it might involve prosecution at the national level, it could involve complaints to the UN, it could involve complaints before the Council of Europe in the European Court of Human Rights. There's a vast menu of accountability options, and I think what the legal task force is doing is sharing its knowledge as to how those work, so that the prosecutor can ensure that the prosecutions in Ukraine are successful, but also that the prosecutions or other accountability possibilities outside of Ukraine are going to be as effective as possible.
Very good. Now, perhaps a final question linking our discussion of war crimes here with your book on war and the legal question of war. But it is also an accountability question. What happens if the international community, if you will, faces a sort of persistent violator of international law, perhaps focusing particularly on the laws of war in this case? And not just talking about individual perpetrators, but a state as well. Let's take Russia as an example, which should, in my view, be aware of the laws governing the situation in Ukraine. And it should be deeply aware that it is violating international law. And yet simply the Russian leadership seems to ignore that. So if such a state were to completely ignore the rules of international law, what could we ever hope to achieve as international lawyers?
I think one has to maybe sort of move sideways and not think too much like an international lawyer. There's a violation, I'm going to go to court, I'm going to get accountability, I'm going to get enforcement. I mean, the situation that Russia is so important, permanent member of the Security Council, even if the ICJ were to rule, the Security Council is not going to enforce it and so on. If one steps sideways a bit and looks at how other states are reacting to these violations of international law, not just by the use of countermeasures, but their general disengagement with Russia and exclusion of Russia from various international fora, I think the more that Russia feels isolated and the more that states feel that they don't want to engage and enter into legal relations, that in its own way is a form of accountability. So I think one has to sort of look at things a little more politically. Even if the mechanisms that are used might be legal, they're not the obvious legal mechanisms. A second route, which is only just now being talked about, is the money. So, of course, you know, under a sort of traditional understanding of a violation of the law, one goes to court, the judge enforces a fine, and the fine is enforced by the national authorities. Here, that's not going to happen in the same way, but a lot of Russian sovereign wealth is abroad. A lot of it has been frozen, a lot of individual wealth has been frozen, and the discussions of the extent to which that money can be used for reparations are just starting. And that is a form of accountability, whether it's through frozen assets or other ways in which these assets are going to be redistributed, even without necessarily being confiscated, is going to give people pause for thought as to whether they want to continue down the same route. So I suppose I would say there will be accountability, but it might be not quite the accountability that one imagines if one is reading the textbooks.
Thank you very much, Professor Clapham. That was an excellent point, very illuminating. Thank you very much for joining us today as well for this conversation, and thank you for watching.